Evening, everybody. Welcome to Reasonable Faith on the 25th of February. Thanks for being adaptable and joining us on Zoom, especially to Beau for being willing to do that with us. It'd be great to have you in person, but this is good enough, I suppose. I'll announce that this Saturday will theoretically be pancakes and pontification. Everything, I assume, will get worked out for that, and more likely than not, it'll either be in Rob's apartment or in the Phase A clubhouse where we did it last time, which seemed to work fairly well. But we'll talk about that and update you. And anybody who's available is welcome to come at 7 and bring your questions as usual. I did want to say administratively that if anybody is here and attended the SOC risk management training last semester, it would be useful for me to know that. Whether you attended it for this club or for another one, just send me a direct message if you attended that really tedious and long meeting, just so that I can be aware. It'd be useful for just compliance and all of that. All right, tonight we're talking about evidence for the soul from neuroscience, which is going to be very interesting in my personal opinion. And we're here with Beau Bishop, so go ahead and take it away.
All right. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Got me? Okay, I got a thumbs up. All right, good. Well, it's always great to be with you guys. Always good to get an invite from Alan, and always enjoyed my time with you guys at UT Dallas. Let me share my screen real quick. Let me figure that out. I do have a slideshow we can follow along with here. Share. Play. Let's see. Can everybody see my slide up right now?
I can.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, cool. Yeah, so there's a couple areas of interest that I have just in terms of just personal study. And one of those areas is just evidence for the existence of the soul. And there's kind of a couple different ways to look at, I think there's kind of three lines of evidence that are really compelling. First is more philosophical in nature. There's various arguments in the philosophy of mind. And in fact, I think most of the actual questions that touch this are more aptly in philosophy of mind versus neuroscience, but I think there's an intersection here. I think neuroscience is also another, there's lines of evidence there. And then the phenomena of near-death experience is kind of a slightly different category all on its own. So I'll just kind of walk through a couple of these things first. Kind of a couple questions here to think about. Really, I want to tackle kind of all three of these. So it is materialism. So again, that would be the view that the material world is all there is. So in terms of how that relates to us, basically, we're nothing more than our physical bodies. I would say in much of neuroscience, there seems to be an unquestioned philosophical presupposition of that in a lot of modern neuroscience work. And then I think most of the field of AI adopts some, again, unquestioned philosophical assumptions related to personhood and kind of equates us with machine functionalism or behavioralism. These are kind of isms from philosophy of mind that are really describing us. But I really want to focus in on materialism. Are we just our physical bodies? Is that it? Or is there any other evidence that is beyond that we have a soul? Or is there any spiritual substance to us at all that is non-physical? This is oftentimes, when we're talking about consciousness, it's oftentimes called the hard problem of consciousness, which is named by David Chalmers, who is a prominent philosopher of mind. And he says consciousness poses the most baffling problems in the science of mind. There is nothing that we know more intimately than our conscious experience, but there's nothing that is harder to explain. He calls it the hard problem because he thinks it's actually intractable. It's not a solvable problem because philosophically speaking, there's a number of traits or properties or attributes. Oh, we've got a lot of feedback from somebody's. I don't know if anybody else can hear that. A lot of background noise there. There's a number of traits or properties or attributes of your conscious experience that are not shared by any physical states. And just to give you a handful of examples here without diving into these too deeply, um, you can have conscious states. So think like thoughts or beliefs. Those are states of consciousness. They can be true or false. It doesn't even make sense to say that a physical state is true or false. If you have a giant pile of BBs or Legos or neurons, it doesn't matter what the physical property of the matter is. It doesn't make sense to really say, hey, this is a true physical state. But your conscious states do have this property. They're not extended in space. Qualia is a fancy word for saying like there's a what it is like component of your first person experience, and physical states don't have this property. Intentionality is a fancy word for it just means about things, aboutness. So your conscious states, like your thoughts and beliefs, they can be about things, but a physical state cannot be about something. Doesn't even make sense for me to. I like to use a giant pile of Legos when I'm in person. If I said, "Hey, can you come make this pile of Legos about World War II, please?" Like that is even we're talking. It's like it's a category error. It's kind of like saying, what does the color green sound like? That's like it's a nonsensical statement, but yet our conscious states have these properties. We have free will. There our states of consciousness are unified. Physical states are not. There's first person subjectivity related to conscious states, and then physical states are available in the third person. There's no first person subjective experience, as David Chalmers said. And so, what does that mean? Well, that means that our conscious states and physical things are apples and oranges. Philosophically speaking, they're just not the same thing. And so, this is what's called the hard problem in philosophy of consciousness. And many philosophers are trying to adapt very fancy, fancy views in philosophy to try to get around this problem. Chalmers is one of those. But I think it's highly compelling on just the philosophical grounds that our consciousness is not physical. And so I think there's strong philosophical evidence that there's more to us than just our physical bodies. So now kind of diving in a little bit more to neuroscience. So one fascinating phenomenon that many would point to here would be split brain operations. Typically, these are done um, to relieve some kind of illness, typically like severe seizures, for example. So the when you sever the hemispheres, it can produce a result of reducing the severity of extreme seizures, and so that's oftentimes why these types of operations are performed. But when we don't see people emerging from a split brain operation with any type of severed conscious experience. We don't have two people all of a sudden. We don't have various conscious states disconnected from one another. It doesn't. This split brain operation would seem to, if we simply are our brains or our physical bodies, this would seem to indicate that there's something going on here that is more than just the two hemispheres of our brain. Of course, there's a deep correlation between brain states and our mental states. I'm happy to talk about that if somebody has a question later. If you stab me in the brain, of course, you can impair my ability to be conscious, but that it doesn't follow that therefore I am my brain. Um, we can talk through that problem later if somebody wants to address it. Um, I've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to kind of move quickly here. Another very interesting line of neuroscientific evidence here is had to do with brain mapping that was done by originally by Walter Penfield, who did a lot of this early work. And the brain itself doesn't feel pain. Your skull does, and your scalp does, but given local anesthesia there, you can do even open brain surgeries without really any pain. And so he actually did some of these surgeries and worked by placing, low voltage electrodes in regions of the brain to try to elicit some kind of response on people. So they're fully conscious, they're having this operation, and he's really kind of the grandfather of really mapping a lot of these areas. So we think about like, okay, if we excite parts of the motor cortex, maybe someone's arm might raise or move involuntarily. What was fascinating, so what Penfield began his career as a materialist. He held the view that the brain was the full story of the human person, but he ended his career as a staunch dualist. And he noticed that people could categorically differentiate between involuntary movement of their body and movement that they initiated themselves. Another way of saying that is they could tell the difference between deciding to raise their hand or their arm and their arm going up. And so they would even say things like, "Hey, I didn't do that. You did that to me." So he also was always fascinated by the fact that it was only a lot of like these lower kind of gross motor function kind of things that he could stimulate. People were never stimulated to have to do like higher order thinking or reasoning. So he never was able to use electrodes to have someone begin performing calculus in the operating theater. I mean, and he wondered to himself, like, why are there, if there are bodily movements when seizures happen, why are there no intellectual seizures? Why do people not all of a sudden begin composing music or doing mathematics or speaking in a different language? There aren't intellectual seizures. There's only this kind of gross kind of motor movement that's happening. And so he concluded from his research that that meant that a lot of the higher order parts of our conscious experience were not, while they might be mediated by our brains while we're in our body, they're not controlled primarily by and he found no way to map these higher order functionings aside from kind of like just basic body movement type things. Another fascinating point of evidence from neuroscience is both surgical operations that remove large sections of brain tissue, but also something called Dandy-Walker syndrome. Dandy-Walker syndrome is where you have a brain abnormality that forms, and a large percentage of the cavity in the person's head is actually taken up by fluid and not by brain tissue. So they have a fraction of the brain of the normal person with a normal brain structure. They have sometimes as little as 10 or 20% of brain tissue in their head, and the rest of it is a type of fluid that builds up. And what's fascinating is that while some of these people have developmental difficulties, they relatively have the same conscious experience as normal people. And so they have you can have a fraction of a brain, but you're not a fraction of a person. And so it seems to follow that that you're more than just your brain tissue. Something else is going on here beyond simple brain matter. Um, Another line of evidence, I think, from neuroscience is the work by Dr. Benjamin Libet. Some skeptics of free will and skeptics of kind of the hypothesis that we have a soul point to this as evidence um, against the fact that we have free will. The funny thing is that Dr. Benjamin Libet took the exact opposite interpretation of his experiments. What he did was he had his patients wired up to an experiment where they were looking at a clock, and they were asked to press a button in their own timing. They were to make their own choice and to indicate when the button was pushed, where the clock was. And what he noticed is there's a buildup of electrical potential that happens in fractions of a second before someone said they consciously decide to press a button. So they're looking at a clock as it's ticking, there's a button in front of them, and then they decide and they push the button. And what he noticed is that there was this slight delay between that electrical buildup and when they said they were consciously aware of making the decision. So you might look at that and go, okay, well, that something is happening in the brain prior to their conscious experience, therefore you don't have free will. That doesn't exactly follow from the experiment. In fact, Dr. Libet in a control said, hey, okay, this time you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to make a decision about when to press the button, but and make that decision. But instead of actually moving your hand to press the button, make a decision not to press the button. And so the exact same thing happened. They had the conscious experience of the will to the agency to press the button. They refrained from pressing the button, and the brain scans looked identical in both cases. And so what he said was, I haven't proven that you have free will, but I have proven you have free won't. You have the ability to veto decisions. And so while he was skeptical, again, kind of beginning the experiments, kind of came out of those thinking that he had definitively shown that we do have a version of free will. And so I think that's does not sit nicely with a materialist uh, view of the human person. Another fascinating, you probably you might have heard of this. I'm not sure, but another fascinating phenomenon is neuroplasticity. Um, Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz is kind of the godfather of this. But basically, in kind of simple terms, neuroplasticity is the ability to actually change the structure of your brain and the circuits in your brain through directed thinking. So you're able to use thinking tools and exercises to change the physical structure of your brain. Dr. Schwartz is a expert in obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's where this is his patients are the type of patients that fixate on a particular behavior or fixate on a particular thought and are unable to kind of get out of that obsessive thinking. So these are people that think, okay, I have to wash my hands 20 times before I go to sleep, and I can't go to sleep until I've washed my hands 20 times. And they fixate on this type of strange thought process. And so what he does to treat them is he has themselves begin to develop an inner dialogue with their thoughts. And when they feel the compulsive thoughts, and this is actually very much connected to addictive cycles as well for folks that struggle with addiction. But they're able to interrupt this process. One of his kind of famous lines is that neurons that fire together wire together, and so you can consciously choose to fire different neural pathways with directed thinking, and over time, those new neural pathways that you're creating change the structure of your brain. And what seems to follow from this, and this is Dr. Schwartz's takeaway here, is that if through directed thinking I'm able to change the structure of my brain, it follows that my thinking is not the structure of my brain. I'll say that one more time. If I'm able to change the structure of my brain through directed thinking, it follows that my directed thinking is not the structure of my brain. They're not identical to one another. So I think this is a powerful example of from neuroscience that there's something more going on here to the human person than just our brains and our bodies. The placebo and the nocebo effect. You've probably heard of the placebo effect before. That's where in like a drug trial, someone, you have a control group that is taking a placebo. So let's say that it's a new type of blood pressure medication or something like that's being they're doing trials on, and you've got some group in the trial that is taking the actual medication, and then there's some group, a control group, that's taking a sugar pill that's a placebo. And they have to factor in clinical trials, they have to factor this in because you can produce through your own psychology and your own belief, you can produce physical effects in your body. So you can, and people do, lower their blood pressure with sugar pills for some reason, and this is called the placebo effect. The nocebo effect is the reverse of the placebo effect. It is having a negative view or having a negative belief about an outcome, and then that becoming a physical reality. So again, these are both beliefs and psychological states that are making physiological changes in the body somehow. And so a good example of the nocebo effect would be patients. You might hear someone say, hey, they lost their will to live and they died suddenly. This phenomenon does happen with people that have been married for a really long time. If the husband passes soon, the wife might pass very soon unexpectedly. There doesn't seem to be a physical explanation, but it just seems like it's the body shuts down. So these have been called one of the most mysterious things in science. This famous article here talked about like the top 13 anomalies that don't make sense in this journal, and placebo nocebo is number one. Okay, terminal lucidity. This is another phenomenon in neuroscientists. These are some doctors that have recently done some recently. I mean, for you guys, you're pretty young. This isn't recent to you. This is recent to me and Alan, 2014. Um, but this study is fascinating. Terminal lucidity is the phenomenon where you have um, partial or even complete restoration of cognitive functioning, very close to the time of death. So take people that have maybe been Alzheimer's patients for decades, have a complete restoration of cognitive faculties a day before they die. That's what terminal lucidity is, this phenomenon. Some of these cases are so pronounced that one in particular that I found the most fascinating was a mental patient that had been severely mentally handicapped from birth, became completely lucid the day she died, was able to converse, sing songs. This is someone who never formed speech her entire life, was able to have this lucid moment right before death. And so it's an interesting phenomenon. And here's just some of the results of the study. The conclusions of the research is that it appears to be a real phenomenon. We don't yet know how often it happens, and prospective studies would be needed for that. Even severely demented patients may experience terminal lucidity to a degree which mimics full recovery of cognitive functioning. And no definable causes for terminal lucidity are found. Neither is the mechanism understood. So, what is that showing us? That's showing us that in terms of if I'm just my brain, the moments before death are going to be as atrophied and and diseased as my brain is going to get while I'm alive. So it does not seem to follow if I'm just my brain that I should have this kind of recovery of cognitive functioning. That does not sit well if I'm simply a material object. That's a bit inexplicable. One of my another favorite story of mine was a patient that was part of this study that had been a dementia patient for years. The week of her death, woke up, remembered who her daughter was, remembered her daughter's phone number, grabbed the phone in her room, dialed her number, had a conversation as if she was, 25 years younger, and remembered everything. And then a few days later, she died. So this is kind of what terminal lucidity is. So it seems to be, it's unknown, it's physically unexplainable, but it seems to be there's something more to the human person here that's happening near death that seems to be over and above simply just the meat between our ears. Okay, so I covered a lot of ground, and I'm trying to move quickly because I know there'll probably be a lot of time for questions and things like that. But I also want to spend some time on near-death experiences too. So I'm happy to go back over any of that neuroscience stuff that I just kind of covered there. If anyone has any questions here in a little bit. I really initially I was really kind of skeptical. I had done a lot of study on philosophy of mind and some of the neuroscience stuff, but in fact, I think it was years ago. But I was thinking of some of the times I spoke at there at UT Dallas, where I just had people inevitably talking about the soul. This would come up, and I was always a little bit skeptical of these, and really began to dig into the actual literature and the evidence, and was surprised at how much of it there is and how well documented it is. I mentioned evidential approach because there are different types of near-death experiences. Of course, many are simply personal accounts or anecdotes about things that people experienced or saw, and I think those have value, especially the sheer number of them that are happening. That's it's pretty astonishing. But I'm most impressed by the evidential cases where a person has an experience while dead and comes back with information that they would be unable to have, and that which includes things that are happening like in other rooms in a hospital or other places, is able to recount conversations or things that have happened while they were clinically dead. That's more evidentially powerful in my mind than simply recounting of a story. And so, a couple things to realize is that this is not a small phenomenon. In fact, I mentioned to my business partner today that I was going to be giving this talk, and he was like, "You're kidding me. I played golf this past weekend, and one of the guys that I was partnered with told me that he had one of these experiences." We were in the middle of a round of golf, and the guy's like, "Yeah, well, during COVID, I got really sick and I died, and I went to heaven and I came back." and and my partner was like, "What? I don't know if I can play golf right now. I got to hear this story." So it's a really common phenomenon, and there's been quite a lot of research that's published in peer-reviewed journals, and these are some of the top people doing work in this area. All these people are still alive and doing work here. Um, so many near-death experiences have common features, and what's really fascinating is that these common features are cross-demographic, meaning they seem to cross socioeconomic, religious, cultural boundaries. And so not every near-death experience is identical, obviously, but they do have a lot of common features. And these are very common. The people report to have hyper-conscious states. So these are direct quotes. This was the most vivid experience I'd ever had. I was more alive than ever before. I've never been able to see in such detail. Like these are the kinds of things. It's almost as if when they were in their bodies, their conscious experience was kind of dull, and for the first time, it was like fully alive. And that's a very common feature of near-death experiences. Another common feature is some kind of out-of-body experience where they're able to be above their body. They see their body. They can tell that's their body. They're typically confused by that experience. They see what's happening in the room or in other rooms, or able to even move about a little bit and see what's happening in other places where their body is not. That is a common phenomenon. Some kind of a tunnel. That's a common feature. They travel through some kind of a tunnel. There is oftentimes some kind of personal being of light. Typically, it's described as just being this being of light being full of love, or the most love that they've ever felt, or they're engulfed or swallowed up by love. These are the kinds of things that are typically described. Another common feature is a life review. Sometimes people say it's like I could see almost in a panoramic view every moment of my life, or I was shown my entire life, and it didn't. I was consciously aware of it, but it happened quickly. So they even struggled to kind of describe the life review, but that's a common feature. Seeing or meeting dead relatives or friends. This is very common. Overwhelming sense of joy. Typically, some kind of a boundary point. They're told, "Hey, you can't come." Either they are told they can't go any further, or they're pushed backwards in a back towards their body in some way. They're unable to go further. And then sociologically speaking, it's really fascinating. There's been some social studies that have been done. These are life transformative events. And what's fascinating is that some of these studies compare the difference between people that flatline on a crash cart or flatline, they die, they're resuscitated, versus people that have these experiences. So both people have a brush with death, yet only one of them has this like life transformative change. And it includes things like total changes of personality, total changes of their interests, their hobbies, sometimes their relationships or even their career. It alters their trajectory of their life in a pretty transformative way. And so these are common features that NDEs have. So here's a couple examples. I'm going to share a few. There's more that we could talk about, but I'm going to share kind of three that I find really fascinating that are more evidential in nature. So one is about a young girl named Katie who drowned in a swimming pool, and she was rushed to. When the EMTs got there, she was already dead. They were able to resuscitate her on the way back to on the way to the hospital, but she had brain swelling and was basically in a coma the entire time and given very little chance of living. And her family, she had a brother and a mom and a dad who were with her at the hospital for some time. But then after she got stabilized, they took their son back home. and were planning to come the next day. Well, when Katie came to a few days later, the doctor came to sort of do just to get see how she's doing and talk to her, and the girl started to tell him that she had seen what they were doing, that they were working on her when she arrived at the hospital. And he was a little confused at first. He probed, and she was able to describe other nurses and staff that were part of the resuscitation efforts and the stabilization efforts. And of course, he was fascinated. And then she also told him that she was able to see her mom, dad, and her brother at home. So she saw her brother. She was able to recount the exact toy that he was playing with in the living room. She saw her dad, and he was just sitting on the couch, just staring forward. And she thought that was strange because she'd never seen her dad do that before. And of course, he was at home and in shock and just mental turmoil because his daughter's in the hospital. She saw her mom preparing chicken and rice in the kitchen for dinner for the family, and so she was able to recount all of this information. And of course, the house was nowhere near the hospital, so there's no way for her to know any of these things. And she was really little. She was able to describe very technical procedures that they were doing, medically speaking. And it has an evidential nature here that she would not be able to make this up or to have this knowledge without actually having this out of body experience. Another case that was published in the Lancet Medical Journal was about an elderly man. He was I can, if someone wants the details, I can get them the study. I can't remember. It's somewhere in Europe. I want to say like Denmark or somewhere like that. An elderly, he was a homeless man, had been found in a park and was taken to the emergency room and died in the emergency room. And in their resuscitation efforts, he left his body. He was able to see everything that was happening while they were trying to resuscitate him. They took his dentures out to intubate him, and they stuck his dentures in a metal cart that was on like casters on wheels. They were pushing around, and they just took him out and threw him in the drawer. And so he was watching all of this happen, and a few days later he regained consciousness, and a nurse walked in, and he said, "Hey, you're the one that took my teeth." And and he remembered who had taken his teeth out, and he said, "I need my dentures back." And she said, "I don't know where they are." And he said, "Yeah, they're in the drawer in that cart that you were pushing around the room." And so she was able to go back to the cart and find the dentures that she had placed in the drawer. And so he was above his body watching all of this happen. So that's another fascinating evidential NDE. The last one that I'll talk about is, I think, scientifically speaking, the strongest, and that's the near death experience of Pam Reynolds, excuse me. And Pam had an issue in her. She had some arteries in her brain, or blood vessels, excuse me, in her brain that had some kind of complication, and it was so severe that it's one of those that if they had ruptured, she would have died instantly. And once she was diagnosed, she found out there was a doctor that was pioneering some new surgeries to repair this kind of a vessel problem, and that's Dr. Robert Spetzler. And Spetzler pioneered a surgery it sounds very severe, but in Pam's case, it worked. Um, and basically, what he has to do is he has to stop the patient's heart. He has to stop the patient's brain. They're clinically dead. He has to remove all the blood from their body, so they have no blood in their body. He performs the operation. They put the blood back into the body, and they resuscitate the patient. That's the procedure. So it's pretty severe. Obviously, it's risky, but this is the surgery that Pam had. And so, in order to make sure that there's no electrical activity in the brain, she was hooked up to quite a lot of instrumentation. So there is a lot of instrumentation measuring all of her brain activity. In fact, she had in her ears, they have like earphones that are producing clicking noises, really loud clicking noises, because even when you're unconscious, your auditory nerves will register noise. The brain activity is you can measure the brain activity of the involuntary auditory response. And so these loud clicks are going off in your ear to and they're measuring the brain activity to make sure there's no brain activity happening. And so they basically have to kill the patient, have to stop the heart, stop the brain, remove the blood, perform the surgery, and then reverse all of that. And so Pam does not remember she received anesthesia before entering the operating room. She doesn't remember anything about that, but the first thing she remembers is popping out of her body. And she was above her body and watched the operation. She was able to recount the specific types of tools that Dr. Spetzler used, which were not, they're very highly specialized tools that are not common. There was an issue with, they were working or had, were draining blood from the right side of her leg, an artery there, and they had some kind of issue, and they had to go. Dr. Spetzler made the nurses go to her left leg. She heard that entire conversation about the right leg having trouble and then having to go to the left leg. This whole thing, she was able to basically recount their conversations as they were performing the surgery. She did have other, common features. She did leave the operating room and had some of the other, like the tunnel of light, the being of light, seeing relatives. She had that experience as well after her out of body experience. And so here we have a clinically dead person that is hooked up to instrumentation. She has to have no brain activity. She has to have no blood and no heart function, and in order for the surgery to work. And so there's no way for Pam to have been able to recount, to see the things that she was able to see, not physically speaking anyway. And so I think all of these are cases that point very strongly to the fact that we're not just our brains. Our brains are part of our bodies, and they're certainly correlated. Our brains are correlated with our conscious experience, but it's not the full story. There's more to us than simply our brains and our bodies. So a couple other factors of near-death experiences here. People that are deaf hear for the first time. So even people that were born deaf, they have out-of-body experiences and they're able to hear what's happening. This is a really fascinating. The colorblind see color for the first time. That's another a feature of near-death experiences. And then really one of the really fascinating ones for me is the blind. The people that have been blind for birth, their very first visual experience they've ever had is during a near-death experience. And so here I've got some quotes. "I've never seen anything, no light, no shadows, no nothing. In my dreams, I don't even see visual impressions. It's just taste, touch, sound, and smell, but no visual impressions of anything." In reference to her NDE, she says, "It was incredible, really beautiful. I was overwhelmed by that experience because I couldn't really imagine what light was like." She saw light for the first time. And so these are fascinating, I think, other points of evidence that have an evidential nature. You have people that have never had a visual experience recounting a visual experience after an NDE. So back to my first question about materialism. Is the material world all there is? Are we just our physical bodies, or is there something about us that is non-physical in nature? So I think all of these areas that I've covered, if you think about a cumulative case here against materialism in this area, the immateriality of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, split brain, Penfield's mapping of motor function, and his fascination that there are no intellectual seizures that happen. People with Dandy Walker syndrome that have a fraction of an actual brain tissue but have relatively normal conscious experience. Free will, the Libet experiments, that doesn't fit. Neuroplasticity, we're able to, through directed thinking, we're able to change physical brain structure. So it follows that our thinking is not simply our brain structure. The placebo effect, nocebo effect, terminal lucidity, and obviously these evidential near-death experiences. So I think if you look at kind of, I've covered quite a lot of ground here, and I moved relatively quickly, and obviously could dive a lot deeper into any one of these. You could probably do an entire lecture over just one of these things, but all things considered, I think materialism does not fit all of the evidence. It's like all these clothes trying to be packed into the suitcase. When you can't get it all in. It certainly accounts for certain things, but if materialism, if I'm not just my physical body, that means that there's more to me than my physical body. I love this quote by D.L. Moody. I shared it last time I was with you guys, I think, but he says, someday you're going to read in the papers that D.L. Moody of East Northfield is dead, but don't you believe a word of it. At that moment, I'll be more alive than I am now. And of course, our Lord said, I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet he shall live. So I think there is both scriptural and philosophical and scientific and near-death experience evidence that we are more than just our physical bodies and that we do in fact have a soul. So I will stop there, stop sharing. I covered a lot of ground. It might have felt like drinking from a fire hydrant a little bit, but maybe I'll just pause here and give some time for a little bit of back and forth and Q&A time. Does that sound good, Alan?
Sounds great, Beau. Awesome job. That was a really good summary of a lot of the key evidence. So it's a pretty compelling case. I just find this stuff to be really fascinating. Yeah, Dr. Michael Egnor gave a talk in Denton just recently on this, and you're totally in line with that professor of neurosurgery who himself has seen some of those split brain patients and all that. So yeah, it's really
and
compelling.
what I love about him too, he's of course a great doctor and scientist, but he's also really well read in the philosophy, unlike many neuroscientists that I hear pontificating on this subject of the soul. They're experts about the brain, but to call their philosophy sophomoric would be a insult to sophomores, as Alvin Plantinga once said. So they're not even familiar with the arguments, many of them. So, well, what questions do you guys have? I covered a lot of ground. I'm happy to dive in deeper to a particular area or answer any particular question. I don't know what I see a hand next to Rob. Is that somebody raising their hand? I don't know if is Rob, do you have a question? I can't hear Rob. Can anyone else? Maybe put it in the chat. Put it in the chat, Rob. Can you maybe put your question in the chat? Because I can see your chats.
While you're working on that, Rob, I'll ask a question. I'm curious how, Beau, you define the soul, because a lot of this is evidence in favor of the proposition that materialism is not a sufficient explanation, but it'd be nice to have a definition of what you're evidencing the existence of.
Yeah. There's a couple different views here, obviously, and I would say that it's an immaterial substance that contains my consciousness and enlivens my body. That's a very dense definition that might take a little while to unpack, but maybe a simple way of thinking of it is it's an immaterial substance. That means it's not composed of matter. It is directly correlated and connected with my body and my brain, but it is not the same thing. So I am a form of a substance dualist. There's many forms of dualism in philosophy of mind, and I'm what you might call a Thomistic dualist. So there's a couple of views that are possible here, but I don't think that other views, like obviously I've argued against primarily materialism here, but there's other views too, like property dualism or epiphenomenalism and a few other isms that are panpsychism. These are all different theories of philosophy of mind. I think they fail for other reasons, but so to define a soul, it's an immaterial substance that contains my consciousness and is enlivens my body. It's correlated with my body.
I'm curious then if you have any thoughts about, or if you've read Bishop N.T. Wright's theology of the soul.
I have read some of his critiques. Unfortunately, in the little I've read, I love N.T. Wright. I think he's a brilliant theologian, obviously a great New Testament scholar. He does seem to have some philosophical confusions that I've noticed. He seems to equate any form of dualism to some kind of like hard Cartesian dualism, but that was put forward by Descartes, or a Platonic view of the soul by Plato. And uh, Dr. J.P. Moreland has written some responses to N.T. Wright to help him to understand that he hasn't that that he's not wrestling with the philosophical concepts well as a theologian. And so I think it's a gentle admonishment from a fellow believer from JP. But yes, I am a little familiar with some of his views, and I do share his skepticism of the form of dualism he's critiquing. Let me put it that way. But I just don't think that I think he's is unaware that there's other literature here, other scholars that have done some different work that he may be not familiar with, or at least not interacting with.
All right, Rob finished his question here. So
How do we distinguish between genuine and made-up near-death experiences? It seems to be the question. Well, I guess we might have to define our terms a little bit, what we mean by genuine and made up. I mean, I guess, like, how do we know people aren't just making them up? Maybe that's part of, maybe that's kind of underlying the question here. Um, well, there actually was some studies that were done where they asked people that did have a brush with death to basically try to make one up, like what happened. And oftentimes the people that were asked in that control to do that recounted things that sounded more in line with like an episode of ER or some other medical drama that they had seen, and not actual things that had happened or would happen medically speaking. I think the evidential ones where people are recounting specific events that while their brain their heart has stopped and their brain is not is either not functioning or they're completely unconscious or in a coma of some kind. That's an evidential way of knowing that it's not a made up story. If you can is he's got a second question. Is this Melvin Morse the same one who was convicted for waterboarding his stepdaughter? If so, does this cast doubt on the Katie testimony? Melvin Morse. I'm not familiar. Let's see here. I would have to look into this. I'm just now pulling up the link. I don't know who this person is, and I don't know anything about this story. So, Rob, yeah, don't know. I don't know the answer to your second question, so I'll have to look into this link that you shared. I don't know.
There are so many of them by people who are non-believers and are so well documented, even with these kind of scientific details, that it would strain credulity to think that they could somehow deceive everybody and have a motive to do so, and
Well, like
that kind of thing.
the sheer number of them is really phenomenal. It's not, we're not talking about, of course I only shared a couple cases, but we're not talking about a handful. The literature here is quite deep. And so I think there was something like over 100 of the researchers categorize the difference between just stories and evidential cases. So evidential cases are like I described, like where there's something falsifiable here that we could look at. There's evidence beyond an anecdote or a personal story. And so Janice Holden has peer-reviewed work. I think it's like 100 plus evidential cases of near-death experience or something. I can't remember the exact one, but I see that you're sharing some stuff about Melvin Morse, so I'll have to look into it, Rob. Some of the links that you're sharing. I'm not familiar with this specific story, so but I'll look into it. Or I guess that was Travis that shared a link. So it looks like it's a video.
He was kind of feeding off of what Rob had shared with another thing.
Okay. Obviously, and it could. I mean, it could be. I mean, it could be that this Melvin Morse guy, the doctor, is a total dirtbag and did something terrible. Obviously, doesn't follow that his research is bad. that would be the definition of an ad hominem or a genetic fallacy. But you know, that his research is false because he's a bad guy. That wouldn't follow. But I do want to figure out what you're talking about. So I don't know. I'll have to research it more. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. Is it Dylan?
Hey, okay, so want to pick your brain about something. I guess no pun intended.
You pick my
So
mind, brain.
there you go. There you go. I'll pick your soul about something. So in certain, I'm a psych major, so this is like right. I'm in love with this conversation. So with someone like a Phineas Gage, so they get a pull through the frontal lobe. We've sort of mapped different personality areas to different areas of the brain neurophysiologically.
Mhm.
So would this soul be something that has like some sort of personality element to it, or is the brain this kind of storehouse of personality in almost the same way that like you could say that the brain is the storehouse of like memories and things like that?
Yeah, great question. And underneath that question is the correlation question that I mentioned. Like how is it that, like, like obviously our brain, you can impair the brain and modify if you shoved a rod in my head, you're going to modify my conscious experience, just like Phineas Gage. And in his case, we have a drastic kind of case of his personality changing post the traumatic brain injury, right? And so um, philosophers of mind distinguish here between correlation and identity. Like, just because two things are correlated doesn't mean they're identical, right? So just because fire causes smoke, so they can be causally correlated, doesn't mean they're identical to one another, right? And what's fascinating is that it goes both ways. That the correlation, I mean, so like it's true that you can damage the brain and impair our cognitive faculties or our personality in some way, but you can also do the reverse. That's what neuroplasticity is showing. You can use directed thinking to also change the brain. So we have a two-way correlation that's happening here. Another way to think about this is J.P. Moreland's analogy that I love. He says, if I'm in a car and I run over, I hit a curb and I damage the axle, and I can now only the car will only turn right. It won't go left anymore. So I'm impaired. The car is now impaired. Even if I wanted to go the other way, I can't. I've got to turn this other way. It doesn't follow that I'm the car, right? Just because the car is impaired, it doesn't follow that I'm identical to the car. And so, in the same way, just because my brain can be damaged and I'm impaired in some way or changed in some way in Phineas Gage's case, it doesn't follow that he is his brain and body. And so it could be very much the case. In other words, the evidence here for the soul, or for what's happened here, is empirically equivalent, meaning like you could say, hey, that's good evidence that the brain is the mind and that there isn't anything else. Now you'd have to deal with all the other evidence that I discussed tonight, but you could say, okay, one point of evidence might be we damage the brain, therefore something changes in our conscious experience or our personality. But it doesn't follow that that if because on my view as a dualist, the same thing is possible, right? The Phineas Gage, that doesn't surprise me in the slightest that would happen, on my view of the soul and the brain. And so when they're empirically equivalent on both sides, I don't think it's a strong argument for materialism. You'd asked one other part of your question and help me think of it. You said something about, does our soul define our personality or something along those lines? What was that last part?
What's the relationship between the soul and what we would generally speaking call like an individual's traits, of things about them?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're like the case of the obsessive compulsive patients in Jeffrey Schwartz practice. Um, they have a predisposition to a certain type of behavior or personality. And what he works with him to do is to develop new brain structures to overcome that negative pattern, right? And so I am certainly affected by, and I think the sort of biblical or theological language we could use here, if I sort of take off the philosophy or neuroscience hat, put on the biblical theological hat, we might say that that I have a fallen nature, and that because of the fall, that sin entered the world, and that we have things like disease and brain disorder and cancer and terrible things. And so, on a Christian worldview, I should expect that to be the case, that we're going to have these kinds of problems, and that if what Scripture says is correct, that He will make all things new, and that will there be a new heavens and a new earth. Well, at some point, I'll have a body that won't have these kinds of problems, and cases like Phineas Gage will be set right on that sort of view. So yeah, I do think that both the soul impacts the brain, and I think that the brain can also impair our conscious states, which are non-physical in nature. So I think you have a two-way street that happens there. That's my view. Of course, there's a lot of different views here, but all right. I see some stuff in the chat here. Sorry, catching up. Phineas Gage Reach talk. Oh, so Dr. Egnor says he attributes the changes just to the trauma of the major injury that just as easily could have happened from a non-brain injury. So yeah, yep, cool. Anybody else got a question? I don't know. Alan, keep us on, or Keith, keep us on time here on.
We're doing fine. Robert has a question here.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little further on the idea of the directed thinking altering the brain state, because I'm having trouble seeing the correlation, the causation there, because it seems to be that you could have a part of the brain that's, say, like the central thinking part that only changes, say, like other parts of the brain, and those other parts could like affect your thinking. Or I guess could you just elaborate a bit more on
Sure.
how that follows?
Yeah, I might not have understood everything about the question, so if I totally whiff on this, maybe help me understand better. But yeah, I just to kind of speak to that more directly. Yeah, so Dr. Schwartz, and he has an entire book you might want to pick up. It's called "You Are Not Your Brain." I recommend it to, if you want, especially if you want to learn more about that particular topic. It's a great read. And of course, he's going to do a much better job of articulating than I will on this. But yeah, well, first of all, there is no central locus of thought in the brain. So neurologically speaking, that's not. Now we have different region. We certainly have mapped certain regions that if you impair them, you're going to have a hard time thinking. But it's not as if like there's this one little part over here that this is where thought happens. And then, because what you're changing with these patients through neuroplasticity is thinking. Like you're changing how your brain is physically wired, and you're doing it through directed thinking. And so, like I said before, it seems to follow that if I can change my brain chemistry and the physical structures of my brain through thinking, then my thinking itself is not determined primarily by brain chemistry and brain structure, because I can change my brain and my brain chemistry.
Yeah, one example that I'm thinking of is, say, like self-modifying code. Like you could have code that like rewrites part of its own execution to then be run and produce different output like in the future. So I'm trying to think about, would that be a valid counter to that idea, do you think?
I'm just thinking through that. So you have code basically in that case. You've got some kind of pre-coded algorithm that's analyzing.
Yeah, this would assume like your thoughts are all like deterministic, right?
Well, there's that
yeah.
problem, but I'm just making sure that I understand the analogy. So you'd have a pre-built algorithm that's sort of evaluating events that are happening inputs, outputs that are happening to the system, and then rewriting core functions in response to those. Basically, am I getting it right? Kind of how you're thinking of
Yeah,
this?
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I maybe have to think about it. Of course, that's a those obviously in this case that is that algorithm is a pre-coded sort of static logic that's been built in by and it's fully deterministic, which our thoughts are not deterministic. Although we certainly can be like Dr. Schwartz talks about how sometimes thoughts and behaviors can be sort of on autopilot, which is so when he talks about like addictive cycles that sometimes people are actually not so much thinking but reacting, and so a lot of his work is actually getting them to pay attention. Attention is all you need apparently. So I don't know, joke, science or computer science joke there. But the paying attention to that the cycle as opposed to just reacting, you're actually thinking. So he believes you have to have some kind of active agency or active will in order to do this, and maybe just look to his book. Like I said, I think he probably maybe answer your question a little bit better than I'm able to. But yeah, I will put some thought into the question though, regarding kind of self-correcting code and how that might be analogous or disanalogous here. So I haven't thought about it much.
One quick thought on that, just to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, Beau. But I mean, it does seem to be significantly different in that Schwartz's therapy relies on this conscious experience, and he's helping them to kind of see and realize that you're getting these thoughts that don't make any sense. You need to learn to ignore them. It's requiring input from the outside, whereas the self-coding thing is, by definition, it's all just built into the pre-existing algorithm that would automatically redo the code.
Yes. Well, the code can still take in input from, say, like the keyboard, or say you have a camera, or like it's a microphone or something. So it could still take in input from the world, but
Yeah,
yeah.
I think anything where though you have the conscious experience driving the brain is really hard to reconcile with materialism, at least. Like how do you have causation that direction? It expects causation only the other direction.
Yeah.
I guess you can say the code didn't write itself in the first place. It can rewrite, but there was a cause at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then you have the whole problem of information to begin with. What is the only thing that we know of that causes information is a mind. So, all right. Any other questions or thoughts? All right.
Doesn't look like it.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. Hopefully, some of this was helpful. And
Yeah, Beau, thank you very much. We'll clap over our pictures.
okay.
Yeah. A lot of thought-provoking stuff there. Thanks a lot, Beau.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Yeah.
And little reminder, I just want to put out that there's quite a few of us that I think are going to be going to Sonic after this. I know everyone might not be like in the area, since not everyone's on campus, obviously. But if anyone wants to, it's the Sonic by the Walmart on Coit and Mapleshade.
Have to poop, but it feels stuck.
Sorry.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here, and God bless.
All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Take care.
May the ducks be with you.
See you guys.
Oh my gosh.